The 20th of April, 1944, 19,000 feet, night sky over southwest Germany. The moon hangs behind clouds like a dying lantern. Stars blink cold and far. Inside the black-painted aircraft, slicing through the dark, Flight Lieutenant Doug McLaren adjusts his oxygen mask and peers out through a frost-lined canopy. Below is a sea of ink. Somewhere down there, flak guns, searchlights, and the sleeping towns of the Third Reich. But it's what's above and behind him that keeps his pulse sharp. "Contact, 8 o'clock low," says the voice in his headset. That's Sergeant Al Jenkins, his radar operator, hunched in the back of the cramped cockpit. Calm, efficient, and quiet like the plane itself. McLaren eases the yoke left. The plane banks smooth, almost silent, just the steady murmur of twin Merlin engines vibrating through the plywood fuselage. He doesn't light a cigarette. He doesn't speak. He watches, listens, waits. This isn't a steel beast or a hulking bomber. This thing is lean, almost skeletal, built from wood and glue, and the kind of confidence that made some generals roll their eyes. It's the Havilland Mosquito, and it's the fastest, most feared night fighter in the sky. They called it a joke. When the idea first surfaced in 1938, most people laughed. A combat aircraft made mostly out of plywood? No armor, no defensive guns, and barely room for 2 men? One Air Ministry official famously scoffed. By the time it's built, it'll be shot down. But designer Jeffrey de Havilland saw something they didn't. With metal in short supply, and aircraft factories already choking on fighter and bomber orders, he proposed a plane so fast, so light, it wouldn't need to fight its way through enemy lines. It would simply outrun anything the enemy sent after it. Wood wasn't a weakness, it was the key. And Canada had plenty. Canada's secret weapon, wood and workforce. While Britain focused on Spitfires and Hurricanes, Canada became the heart of the Mosquito's production miracle. Across Toronto, Downsview, and Vancouver, hidden workshops turned out wings, fuselages, and nose cones made by hand. Not by machinists, but by carpenters, cabinet makers, and furniture craftsmen. Women in overalls and goggles glued balsa sheets together over spruce frames. Steam-bent curves were clamped and cured in makeshift ovens. Piano factories stopped making instruments and started building war machines. And here's the twist. It worked. What came out of those quiet Canadian workshops was the most versatile aircraft the Allies would fly in the entire war. Too fast to touch. The prototype first flew in late 1940. It didn't just fly, it screamed. Topping 380 miles per hour, it could outrun the Spitfire, the Hurricane, and every German fighter thrown at it. And that was just the beginning. By 1943, the Mosquito was dropping bombs on Berlin by day and hunting Luftwaffe night fighters by night. It didn't lumber like a B-17 or crawl like a Lancaster. It darted. It disappeared. It delivered a message, then vanished before flak guns could even react. In a sky full of heavy metal, this thing flew like a ghost. April 20th, the hunter strikes. Back in the sky, McLaren's fingers rest on the trigger. The enemy is close now. A Junkers 88 twin-engine night fighter. It's scanning the skies ahead, unaware it's being stalked. Jenkins calls out range. 600 yards. Hold your line. McLaren steadies the Mosquito, feels the vibration settle. Then he squeezes. The Hispano 20mm cannons roar. 4 flashes of light. No tracer rounds, just fire and fury. The Junkers explodes into sparks and smoke, pieces falling silently into the black forest below. No radio call, no counterattack, just silence. And that's how it went, again and again. By the end of the war, Mosquitoes would fly over 39,000 combat sorties, destroying trains, power stations, and enemy fighters before they could lift a finger. The plane, built from Canadian trees, had become the terror of the Luftwaffe. More than just a plane. In the months to come, Mosquito crews would lead Pathfinder raids, fly unescorted photo missions over enemy capitals, and conduct low-level attacks so precise they made headlines. Pilots nicknamed it the Wooden Wonder. The Germans had another name for it, Mosquito Terror. And they weren't wrong. London, 1938. War looms. The Ministry of Aircraft Production is buried in blueprints for armored fighters and massive bombers. But in a modest office at Hatfield, an engineer in a wrinkled vest sketches something no one asked for: a fast, unarmed aircraft made almost entirely of wood. That man is Geoffrey de Havilland, a veteran designer. Quiet, precise, and absolutely certain the future of air combat doesn't depend on armor or gunners, but on speed. He slides his idea across the table to a senior official. The man barely glances at it. No guns? No crew protection? Why would we build this? Geoffrey doesn't flinch. Because it won't need protection if nothing can catch it. The room goes quiet. No one laughs out loud. But no one signs off either. A warplane without guns. At a time when the Royal Air Force was obsessed with building heavies, multi-gun bombers that could slug their way through enemy fire, de Havilland was proposing something closer to a race car: slim fuselage, long wings, minimal crew, no guns, no armor, and built from a material everyone else thought belonged in a school desk: plywood. But de Havilland wasn't out of touch. He'd already proven himself with earlier fighters. What he saw coming was a war where traditional bombers would suffer. Big targets, slow-moving, heavy with deadweight. He wanted to break that logic. Let bombers creep across Europe at 180 miles per hour and get shredded by flak. His design would fly at 380, no escorts needed. Drop its bombs, photograph the damage, and be home for tea. Still, the Air Ministry dragged its feet. Not because the idea was bad, but because it didn't fit the mold. Wartime innovation from workshop floors. With aluminum stockpiled for Hurricanes and Spitfires, de Havilland turned to what Britain and Canada had in abundance: skilled woodworkers and good timber. Spruce, ash, and balsa were light, strong, and easy to shape, especially in furniture shops and piano factories. Engineers built the Mosquito's fuselage in two halves, clamshell style, then glued them together. Wings were molded from layered wood, skinned in birch veneer. Glue became the magic ingredient, strong enough to hold everything at over 400 miles per hour, and light enough to keep it agile. No rivets, no welds, no assembly line headaches. What shocked people most wasn't just that it flew, but how fast it flew. First flight and first shock. On the 25th of November, 1940, at a small airstrip in Hertfordshire, the prototype Mosquito, marked W4050, lifted off the ground for the first time. The test pilot barely pushed the throttle before the aircraft surged ahead. At 382 miles per hour, it flew faster than Britain's frontline fighters. In that moment, the myth shattered. This wasn't a wooden joke. This was a predator. Soon, the Air Ministry came back, and this time, they were listening. They ordered more, not just for reconnaissance or light bombing, but for roles no one imagined. High-altitude photo runs, low-level strikes, night interceptions, and even decoy missions using radar jamming. The Mosquito could do it all, and do it better. Canada answers the call. As orders piled in, de Havilland needed help. Britain was stretched thin, under siege. That's when Canada stepped in. At Downsview, outside Toronto, workers at de Havilland Canada began building Mosquitoes under license. These weren't machines stamped by robots. These were warbirds crafted by hand. Farm boys learned to steam bend fuselage ribs. Women fresh out of high school became glue specialists. Whole towns turned into warplane production zones, not with forges and steel, but with saws, clamps, and calipers. The first Canadian-built Mosquito took to the skies in 1943. It flew just as fast, just as true. From that point forward, Canada would produce over 1,100 Mosquitoes, enough to outfit entire squadrons and fuel Allied missions deep into German territory. Proving the doubters wrong. Geoffrey de Havilland didn't seek fame. He didn't give speeches or chase medals. But by 1944, the world finally understood what he saw from the beginning. The Mosquito wasn't some fragile wooden bird. It was the edge of a blade, sharp, fast, and surgical. Bomber Command trusted it to hit targets no one else could reach. Intelligence officers relied on it to capture photographs critical for invasion planning. And Fighter Command used it to shut down German night fighters before they could even line up a shot. One airframe, one idea, countless missions. And all of it started with a sketch most men dismissed. January 1943. RAF Westmalling, England. Midnight. The hangar lights are dimmed, blackout curtains drawn tight. Mechanics speak in hushed voices as they check the ammunition feeds. 4 20mm Hispano cannons, 4 303 Browning machine guns. No wing tanks tonight. This Mosquito is going hunting. Flight Lieutenant John Jack Kinnard checks his flight suit, then steps toward the black-painted fuselage. It's cold to the touch, dew forming along the smooth wooden skin. But there's no time to think. The Luftwaffe has been hammering British airfields and rail yards at night, sending Junkers 88 seconds and Heinkel 111 seconds under the cover of darkness. Tonight, Jack is going to intercept them. The Mosquito is quiet, almost too quiet. No flashy armor, no defensive gunner. Just 2 men and 2 engines built for speed. As the engines roar to life, the aircraft rolls into the night. Its mission: find German bombers before they can reach their targets, and take them out before they even know what's behind them. Radar in the shadows. Before the Mosquito, Britain's early night fighters were heavy and slow. Blenheims and Beaufighters dragging through cloud banks and missing their marks. But the Mosquito, with its blistering speed and smooth agility, changed the game. Fitted with the AIMK-8 airborne interception radar, it could detect enemy aircraft in total darkness and lock on silently. It didn't need a sky full of searchlights. It didn't need help. In the darkness, the radar operator became the eyes. Sitting behind the pilot in a cramped rear station, he scanned the cathode ray screen like a hunter watching ripples in a lake. A slight flicker, a curved echo, that was enough. Turn left, hold altitude, close to 1,000 yards, now 600. By the time the enemy saw the Mosquito, it was too late. First kill, first shock. That same winter, Jack Kinnard's squadron took down 6 German bombers in 1 week without losing a single aircraft. They struck from above, from the side, from behind cannons, lighting up the night for a few seconds, then vanishing into silence. Most German crews never fired back. They didn't have time. Word spread across Luftwaffe circles. A new predator was in the air. One you couldn't outfly, and worse, you couldn't detect on radar. The Germans tried countermeasures. Faster night fighters, spotter aircraft, trap missions. Nothing worked. By 1944, the Mosquito had become the top night fighter in Europe. It didn't fight fair. It didn't give warnings. And it never stayed in one place long enough for the enemy to hit back. Adaptable and ruthless. The real power of the Mosquito wasn't just its speed. It was its flexibility. Crews modified them for every kind of nighttime mission. Intruder flights. Mosquitoes flew into enemy airspace during German bomber runs, not to defend, but to attack Luftwaffe night fighters as they were landing or taking off. Surrate missions. Using modified radar to track German night fighters by their own emissions, Mosquito crews hunted the hunters with brutal precision. Jamming runs. Some variants carried electronic warfare gear to disrupt German navigation beacons, sending enemy bombers off course into open water or friendly flak zones. And yet, it still looked simple, still wooden, still light. That was the genius. Mission after mission. In less than a year, RAF squadrons flying Mosquitoes racked up hundreds of kills. Aces like Wing Commander John Cunningham scored 20-plus victories in Mosquito night fighters, all under the cover of black skies. German pilots began calling it Der Schwarze Tod, the Black Death. It wasn't superstition. It was fear based on facts. They knew the Mosquito could climb faster, dive quicker, and disappear into cloud banks before any return fire could be mounted. One German survivor recalled, "We never saw them, just flashes. Then we were falling." Precision, speed, survival. Even at high speeds, the Mosquito remained remarkably stable. Pilots could make small adjustments in the dark, line up shots, and pull away in seconds. It was a perfect platform not just for interception, but for execution. Better yet, it got its crews home. Unlike heavy bombers with 7 or 10 men, Most mosquito missions carried just 2, but their survival rate was far higher. That mattered. Every veteran saved was one less telegram, one more voice for the next mission. Morale went up, kill ratios skyrocketed, and the RAF finally had a reliable answer to the German night bombing campaign. Not just a fight or a statement. By 1944, the Mosquito wasn't just a piece of equipment, it was a symbol. A plane that didn't need armor to win. A design built from wood that outflew metal. A crew of 2 that could do the work of 10. It owned the night. And it wasn't done yet. February 18, 1944. 5:55. Amiens, France. The rising sun hasn't yet broken the frost on the rooftops of Amiens. Civilians shuffle through the streets, unaware that high above them, 2 squadrons of mosquitoes are descending fast. Engines throttled back, bomb doors armed, targets locked. Inside one of those aircraft, Flight Lieutenant Ian Stroud stares ahead through the plexiglass. His voice crackles in the headset. 30 seconds. Beside him, his navigator counts down. The target. The Amiens prison. A German occupied facility holding over 700 French resistance members, many scheduled for execution. This is Operation Jericho. The mission: punch a hole in the prison wall, using pinpoint strikes so the inmates can escape. No room for error, no second pass. One shot, low and fast. Precision in a world of carpet bombs. The Mosquito wasn't just fast, it was surgical. While other Allied bombers dropped payloads by the ton hoping to hit something, the Mosquito operated like a scalpel. It could fly under radar, weave through terrain, and strike buildings without leveling the entire city block. This made it the go-to aircraft for missions that were too risky for anything else. Bridges, headquarters, rail hubs, even Gestapo prisons. What made these strikes possible wasn't just engineering, it was confidence. Crews trained at treetop level, flying 280 miles per hour just 50 feet above the ground, dodging towers, avoiding church steeples, and skimming fields. One mistake meant clipping a chimney. One delay meant flak. But when it worked, the results were devastating. Operation Jericho, the door blown open. Back over Amiens, Stroud levels out. The prison comes into view. He lines up the wall. The Mosquito shudders as the bombs drop, delayed fuses to give them time to penetrate the masonry. Seconds later, the wall erupts. Debris showers the snow-covered yard. Guard towers collapse. German sentries run for cover. Inmates flood out through the smoke and twisted wreckage. Behind Stroud, another Mosquito dives in, this one aimed at the administration block to knock out records and delay Nazi retaliation. The entire raid takes 8 minutes. The price: 1 aircraft lost. The reward: over 250 prisoners escape before reinforcements arrive. It was one of the boldest precision missions of the war, and only the Mosquito could have pulled it off. A railway raiders and clockwork destruction. These low-level attacks weren't rare. From 1943 onward, Mosquito squadrons became a nightmare for German logistics. Flying out of England, they targeted key rail lines, locomotive depots, and supply trains. Not from 20,000 feet, but from 200. They'd follow rivers, treetops, and road curves to find their marks. Trains would round a bend only to be greeted by twin 500-pound bombs ripping through the engine block. They did it at dawn, at dusk, sometimes in broad daylight. The effect was immediate. Nazi supply lines slowed. Troop movements became chaotic. Repair crews couldn't keep up. And worst of all, the Germans never saw them coming, disrupting the nerve center. Beyond smashing rail lines, the Mosquito also went after the heart of the German command network: communications. In Berlin, Paris, and Oslo, key Gestapo and SS buildings were marked for destruction. On the 30th of January 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, a group of Mosquitoes struck the Berlin radio headquarters just as Hermann Göring was set to deliver a national broadcast. They knocked the station offline mid-sentence. The timing wasn't coincidence. It was humiliation. Göring, already furious about the Mosquito's inability to be caught, exploded with rage. His quote would become infamous. "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy." The British, who can afford aluminum better than we can, go over to wooden aircraft while we are forced to produce all-metal aircraft, and they knock down one after the other of our buildings. 2 men, 1 target. Every Mosquito attack had a crew of just 2. Pilot and navigator. No gunners, no tail gunners, no bombardier, no radio operator. That meant every second in combat depended on teamwork. A missed cue could put them into flak or a church steeple. A mistimed turn could mean a missed bridge. But when done right, it looked like poetry at 300 miles per hour. Footage from gun cameras shows bombs hitting within feet of enemy trains. Strafing runs tearing through supply columns. Nap of the Earth flight that left German gunners spinning their turrets too late. Every mission they survived made the next one possible. And survive they did in greater numbers than any comparable bomber force in the war. A new kind of air power. What the Mosquito proved in these low-level attacks was simple. The right aircraft, flown by the right crew with the right tactics, could reshape the air war. Not with brute force, not with mass numbers, but with speed, stealth, and precision. April 1944, somewhere over the French coastline, 32,000 feet. The engines hum steady, the cold so sharp it bites through the flight suit. The pilot, Squadron Leader Harold Downing, peers ahead. No contrails in sight, no flak bursts, just the slow sweep of the channel below and the rising coast of Nazi-occupied France. Behind him, Flight Officer Maurice Kane leans into the camera panel. He checks focus, resets frame rate, and levels the massive F-24 reconnaissance camera bolted under the fuselage. Click. Advance. Click. They aren't here to drop bombs. They're here to collect the truth. Every frame they shoot today will end up on a British war room table by nightfall. Bridges, rail yards, German troop buildups, bunkers camouflaged as barns. All of it mapped, measured, analyzed, and used to plan the biggest amphibious invasion the world has ever seen. D-Day. Speed over stealth. The Mosquito's speed wasn't just good for evading fighters, it made it the perfect spy plane. At full throttle, photo reconnaissance Mosquitoes could reach over 400 miles per hour and fly higher than most interceptors could climb. German radar operators often couldn't track them in time. By the time they scrambled fighters, the Mosquito was gone. It didn't need weapons. Its cameras were its payload, and its fuel was time. On an average mission, a Mosquito might cover 1,200 miles over enemy territory, snapping images with extreme precision, sometimes down to 2 feet of resolution. No aircraft in the Allied inventory could match its combination of speed, range, and altitude. Mapping the Atlantic Wall. Starting in 1943, Mosquito PR, photo reconnaissance, units began flying deep into German-held territory to map what Hitler called the Atlantic Wall, a massive chain of bunkers, beach defenses, artillery positions, and tank traps designed to repel an Allied invasion. It wasn't enough to know it existed. They needed to know where it was weak. So Mosquito crews flew every inch of the northern French coast. They photographed Normandy, Calais, Brittany. They identified fake installations, spotted minefields, counted tanks, and most importantly confirmed which roads and bridges could handle German reinforcements. One such photo flight over Normandy in May 1944 revealed freshly installed Hedgehog beach obstacles and anti-landing craft spikes. Within 24 hours, the information was handed to Allied planners. D-Day's success didn't begin on June 6th. It began here in a cockpit at 30,000 feet, with a man holding a camera trigger. Intelligence in real time. What set the Mosquito apart from earlier recon aircraft was how fast the data came back. Using high-speed processing labs stationed in southern England, rolls of film were developed, examined, and sent to command centers within hours of the aircraft's landing. Mosquito crews could fly missions in the morning, and by late afternoon their photos were briefing Eisenhower's staff. This rapid intelligence cycle helped Allied commanders track moving German units, confirm hits from bombing raids, and spot decoy operations like the infamous ghost divisions the Nazis used to mask their true strength. Even German generals began to suspect something was watching them. Something fast. Something invisible. Operation Crossbow. Mosquito recon missions also uncovered one of the Reich's darkest secrets, the V weapon program. In late 1943, strange bunkers and long concrete ramps began appearing across northern France. Allied bombers hit them. The targets reappeared days later repaired or moved. It was mosquito flights that solved the puzzle. Their photos revealed the long launch tracks and storage bunkers of the V-1 flying bomb and the V-2 rocket. This triggered Operation Crossbow, a massive Allied campaign to preemptively destroy these sites before the weapons could be fired. Mosquito pilots risked everything to get close-up images of these secret installations. Some flew just 500 feet above the ground, dodging trees and flak to get the shot. Many never came back. But thanks to their missions, the Allies blunted the effectiveness of Hitler's terror weapons before they could reach full scale. D5. Behind every decision, a frame of film. Whether it was the raid on Peenemünde, the opening of the Normandy front, or the targeting of armored panzer divisions, the path always began with a mosquito. When ground commanders asked where to strike, reconnaissance officers would unroll film strips, circles, arrows, grid marks. Here, that's where their armor is refueling. This stretch of track, that's their main line. That barn, zoom in. See the roof? That's not hay. That's camouflage, netting over an artillery position. The mosquito didn't just scout, it revealed. And it made every Allied strike smarter, deadlier, and faster. Toronto, Ontario, spring 1943. The doors open to a warehouse that doesn't look like a factory at all. No roaring furnaces, no clouds of smoke. Instead, the smell of cut pine and glue fills the air. Inside, rows of men and women in flannel shirts and canvas aprons, sand, clamp, and stitch together the skeletons of aircraft. This isn't Detroit. It's not Bristol. It's Canada building one of the fastest, most feared warplanes in the world using wood, sweat, and craftsmanship passed down through generations of carpenters. The de Havilland Mosquito wasn't just made in Britain. More than 1,100 of them came from Canada. And every single one had fingerprints from farmers, housewives, furniture makers, and newly trained mechanics who worked 12-hour shifts behind blackout curtains without ever seeing the war up close. From timber to terror, Canada's forests supplied the lifeblood. Sitka spruce, birch, and balsa. It was strong, flexible, and lightweight, perfect for the mosquito's double-layer monocoque shell. Fuselages were built in halves, then bonded together like a giant model airplane. Jigs, clamps, and pressure molds took the place of welding torches. Glue was king. Canadian-made casein and formaldehyde adhesives held the entire frame together. Once cured, the airframe could take the stress of high-speed dives and violent maneuvers at 30,000 feet. In total, over 90% of the Canadian Mosquito's structure was wood. The rest? Ingenuity. The people behind the plane. At the Downsview plant in Toronto and Fort William, now Thunder Bay, more than 7,000 Canadian workers assembled mosquitoes around the clock. Nearly half were women. They weren't just riveters or assistants. They were wing fitters, electricians, finishers. They stitched canvas over control surfaces, hand-trimmed panels, and wired the electronics by feel alone. Most had never touched an aircraft part before the war started. One worker, Elsie McGill, an engineer and production manager, became a national icon. Known as Queen of the Hurricanes for her earlier work, she brought that same relentless energy to mosquito production, pushing her crews to meet soaring British demand. Every plane that rolled out of a Canadian hangar bore the quiet pride of thousands. They didn't see combat, but they knew what they were building was tipping the scales. The ferry flights. Once completed, each mosquito was handed over to the Air Transport Auxiliary, where pilots, many of them women, flew them thousands of miles to delivery points. From Toronto, the aircraft were ferried up through Goose Bay, Greenland, Iceland, and down to Scotland. That route was dangerous. Icing, engine trouble, and navigation errors meant some mosquitoes never made it. But those that did were immediately pressed into service across Europe. To the Luftwaffe, it didn't matter whether a mosquito was British or Canadian. They feared them the same. Canadian squadrons in combat. While the planes were built in Toronto, many of the pilots came from across the Canadian provinces. The RCAF, Royal Canadian Air Force, fielded several Mosquito squadrons, flying bombing runs over Berlin, reconnaissance flights over Norway, and night fighter patrols across Belgium. One of the most storied units, number 418 City of Edmonton Squadron, flew the Mosquito in intruder missions, taking the fight directly to enemy airfields. They became one of the most successful Mosquito units in the entire war, destroying hundreds of enemy aircraft, locomotives, and vehicles. Canadian crews, flying Canadian-built planes, on foreign soil, changing the course of the war, one mission at a time. Supplies, innovation, and logistics. Beyond the aircraft themselves, Canada also supplied key materials: aluminum for fittings, rubber for tires, fuel additives, and electrical components. When Britain faced shortages during the Blitz, Canadian industry stepped in to fill the gaps. Without this quiet supply chain, the Mosquito program might have stalled entirely. In fact, Canadian modifications made some Mosquitoes even more rugged than their British counterparts. Winterized engines, reinforced landing gear, and better de-icing systems gave Canadian-built planes an edge in colder climates and longer-range operations. A national effort, a global legacy. The Mosquito wasn't just a British triumph, it was a Canadian one too. In barns and schools converted into workshops, on rail lines that shipped balsa across frozen rivers, in hands that sanded wing spars until they shined like furniture, Canada proved it could build world-class war machines not with steel and noise, but with precision, pride, and perseverance. Every Mosquito that roared over the Channel, every photograph that shaped the invasion of Normandy, every German bomber that vanished from the sky at night, carried a piece of Canada with it. May 1944, near Leipzig, Germany. The German night fighter crew scans the sky, their radar screen flickering in the dim red glow of the cockpit. Nothing but silence. Then an echo. Faint. Moving fast. Too fast. Before they can react, the sky around them explodes with cannon fire. Their Junkers 88 shudders. Flames erupt from the port engine. By the time the pilot even locates the source, it's already gone. It was a Mosquito. And that was the story. Again and again. The Luftwaffe's best defenses, radar, night fighters, anti-aircraft flak, couldn't stop this sleek wooden aircraft that slipped through the dark and vanished before anyone could fire back. But it wasn't magic, it was design. A speed built into the frame. The Mosquito's biggest advantage was speed. Depending on the variant, it could cruise at 415 miles per hour, making it faster than nearly every German fighter at the time, including the famed Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190. But speed wasn't just about horsepower. It was about weight, drag, and efficiency. The Mosquito was light, astonishingly light. Its wooden monocoque fuselage meant fewer rivets, fewer seams, and a smoother aerodynamic profile. That meant less resistance at high speeds, allowing the twin Rolls-Royce Merlin engines to push the aircraft faster than its heavier metal-framed counterparts. Without the extra bulk of defensive guns, gun turrets, or thick armor plating, the Mosquito could climb quicker, turn tighter, and escape when others couldn't. Why it didn't need armor? Most bombers bristled with 50 cal machine guns and armor plate. They flew in formation and fought off enemy fighters with raw firepower. The Mosquito went the other way. No tail gunners, no nose guns for defense, no heavy plating. That wasn't a weakness. It was a decision. Don't get hit. Don't get seen. By flying faster and higher than most of its enemies, the Mosquito turned every mission into a race, not a dogfight. And more often than not, it won. The Luftwaffe's frustration. German pilots and air defense crews had no answer for it. Time and again, Mosquitoes would appear without warning, bomb a target, photograph an installation, or shoot down a bomber and disappear before a single interceptor was in the air. Field Marshal Hermann Göring, furious and embarrassed, famously ranted, "It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy. The British, who can afford aluminum better than we can, go over to wooden aircraft. The Mosquito knocked out 1,000 tons of our supplies while we could not shoot down a single one." His frustration was justified. In 1943 and 1944, less than 1% of Mosquito missions ended in the loss of an aircraft. That's a staggering success rate in a war where bomber crews often faced casualty rates as high as 40–50%. German interceptors tried and failed. The Luftwaffe tried everything. They sent up Me-110 seconds and Ju-88 night fighters with upward-firing cannons. They developed the Heinkel He-219 Uhu, a high-speed interceptor designed specifically to catch mosquitoes. But the Uhu, while dangerous, was rare. It entered combat too late, with too few airframes. By the time it reached cruising altitude, most mosquitoes had already dropped their bombs and were heading home. Even the revolutionary Me-262 jet fighter had trouble. Though faster on paper, the 262 was vulnerable during takeoff and landing, and Mosquito intruder squadrons often attacked Luftwaffe jets on the runway before they could even get airborne. The Mosquito wasn't unbeatable, but it was damn hard to catch. And for German radar crews, it became the ghost they kept chasing but could never pin down. Missions that proved the point. In January 1943, Mosquitoes bombed Berlin in broad daylight not once, but twice in the same day. They struck precisely timed targets, including the German State Radio building, disrupting a major Nazi propaganda speech. Despite the Luftwaffe's best efforts, not a single Mosquito was shot down. They also carried out deep penetration raids flying solo or in small formations to destroy critical Gestapo archives, rail junctions, or enemy radar stations. These missions relied on speed and timing, not brute force. The Luftwaffe simply couldn't adapt. Their planes were too heavy, their airfields too far back, and their radar systems too slow to lock on in time. Intelligence, design, and confidence. The Mosquito was fast, but it wasn't just fast in a straight line. It was fast to deploy, fast to react, and fast to evolve. Its pilots trusted the design. They didn't fly recklessly, but they flew boldly. They knew that every second gained by speed was a second denied to the enemy. When asked how they survived so many missions, most Mosquito crews gave the same answer: because nothing could catch us. Oktober 1943. Essen, Germany. 2:10 vormittags. The Ruhr Valley sleeps under blackout. Anti-aircraft guns dot the rooftops. Sirens haven't sounded. No bombers on radar. Then an explosion. Sharp, precise. One factory window shatters, then another. 10 seconds later, the power grid flickers and dies. The alarms finally wail, but it's too late. The Mosquitoes are already gone. This wasn't a 1,000-plane raid. It wasn't about flattening cities. This was targeted destruction, the kind that cripples an enemy not by terror, but by efficiency. Night after night, the Mosquito struck Nazi industry where it hurt most: factories, command centers, rail choke points, and research facilities. And it did it without fanfare. A new kind of strategic bomber, where B-17 seconds and Lancasters operated in waves, dropping thousands of pounds of bombs over wide areas. The Mosquito carved out a new role: surgical strike bomber. Carrying just two 500-pound bombs internally, or a 4,000-pound cookie in some modified variants. The Mosquito didn't need mass. It relied on accuracy. Flying at treetop level, or from high altitude with pinpoint navigation, it could hit a specific building, an engine assembly line, even a single bridge span, and be out before the Luftwaffe scrambled a response. That changed the nature of Allied air power. It wasn't just about overwhelming force anymore. It was about timing, intelligence, and selective pressure. High-value targets, low-profile attacks. Between 1,943 and 1,945, Mosquito squadrons attacked. Foul weapon research sites in Peenemünde, U-boat pens along the French coast. Gestapo headquarters in Oslo, Copenhagen, and The Hague, rail marshalling yards in Cologne, Hamm, and Leipzig, precision machine factories vital to German tank and aircraft production. Many of these missions were flown at low level, skimming rooftops, dodging power lines, and arriving so suddenly that enemy flak crews barely had time to man their guns. In one famous strike, mosquitoes hit the Schweinfurt ball bearing factory, a facility so critical to the German war machine that its disruption delayed Panzer and aircraft production for weeks. And unlike mass raids that took hours to organize and hundreds of escorts to protect, these mosquito attacks often involve just 6 to 12 aircraft, small groups flying fast, low, and without warning, breaking German repair cycles. Here's what made the mosquito so deadly. It didn't just destroy things, it disrupted cycles. Factories could be rebuilt, rail tracks could be repaired. But every time the mosquito struck, it forced the Germans to stop, reroute, and reorganize. Maintenance crews had to wait for daylight. Workers were evacuated. Power had to be restored. Raw materials delayed. And all of that slowed down tanks, planes, and ammunition heading to the front. In a total war built on timing and output, the mosquito became a constant source of chaos behind enemy lines. Even when it didn't destroy, it interrupted, and that interruption cost Germany more than they could afford. Psychological impact on the Nazis. The German high command knew what the mosquito could do, but what they couldn't handle was that they rarely saw it coming. It flew too fast for fighters to intercept. It flew too low for radar to catch in time. And it flew too smart to waste time on targets that didn't matter. This created paranoia in the German leadership. High-ranking Nazi officials were moved to underground bunkers. Production sites were broken up into smaller facilities. Critical operations were relocated, often slowing them down in the process. One mosquito strike on the Gestapo HQ in The Hague in March 1945 not only destroyed critical interrogation files but also killed several senior officials mid-meeting. This wasn't just an air raid, it was a message. You're not safe, even here. The perfect plane for shadow warfare. The mosquito's mix of stealth, speed, and accuracy made it ideal for secret missions. British intelligence agencies often worked directly with mosquito units to take out sensitive targets, sabotaging infrastructure just ahead of Allied advances, destroying archives and records before the Nazis could relocate them, assassinating high-value officers, and disrupting meetings. In many cases, these missions didn't appear in official RAF briefings. They were black ink orders. Quiet, fast, and clean. A legacy measured in outcomes. By the end of the war, mosquito squadrons had flown more than 39,000 operational sorties. Many of those didn't make the front page, but they helped starve the German war machine of what it needed most: precision, resources, and time. In the air war over Europe, where size once meant power, the mosquito flipped the equation. Small crew, small payload, big results. March 1945. Occupied Denmark. Low altitude, low light, low margin for error. A pair of mosquitoes streak across the horizon, hugging the treetops, their shadows flickering over the snow-dusted countryside. No fighter escort, no bomber formation. Just 2 aircraft loaded with precisely timed explosives and a target hidden in the heart of Copenhagen, the Gestapo headquarters at Shell House. Inside that building are records, names, locations, detailed files on resistance cells across Denmark. And many of those resistance fighters are scheduled to be executed within days. This mission isn't about destroying weapons, it's about saving lives. Operation Carthage, precision with a human purpose. On the 21st of March 1945, 20 mosquitoes from the RAF's No. 140 Wing launched Operation Carthage, one of the most daring low-level strikes of the war. Their target, Shellhus, the Gestapo's regional headquarters in Copenhagen. Why? Danish resistance leaders had begged for it. Hundreds of their fighters had been captured. If the Gestapo's archives weren't destroyed soon, the entire underground network could collapse, or worse, be wiped out. The mission required threading through urban airspace at less than 100 feet. One mistake would mean hitting civilian neighborhoods. 1 second off, and the files might survive. The Mosquito was the only aircraft that could pull it off. At 11 a.m., the lead wave roared over the rooftops, lining up perfectly. Bombs hit dead center, igniting the upper floors and collapsing the roof. The second wave struck minutes later. The archive wing crumbled. Most of the prisoners escaped. Hundreds of resistance lives were spared. Even though a tragic accident led to one aircraft crashing into a nearby school, causing civilian casualties, the mission's objective was achieved. The Gestapo's hold on Denmark was broken, and it was a squadron of wooden aircraft that made it possible. Supply drops and resistance lifelines. Mosquitoes didn't just attack, they also delivered. Late in the war, special Mosquito variants were outfitted for clandestine supply drops to resistance movements in France, Norway, Belgium, and Holland. These missions often took place at night, with no lights and no radio contact. Flying low over forests and farms, the crew would locate drop zones marked with flashlights or fires, arranged in coded shapes. Out the hatch went crates filled with Sten guns, ammunition, radios, medical kits, and food. A single mission could arm an entire partisan unit for weeks. To the Germans, these missions were invisible. To the local fighters, they were salvation. In Spies in the Sky, the Special Operations Executive, SOE, Britain's covert sabotage and espionage force, also relied on the Mosquito to ferry agents in and out of occupied territory. In modified Mosquitoes with removed bomb bays and added fuel tanks, hand-picked pilots flew deep into France or the Low Countries, landing on improvised dirt strips in moonlight to deliver or extract key personnel. Sometimes it was a radio operator, sometimes a saboteur, sometimes a double agent carrying stolen plans in a hollow shoe heel. Every mission was voluntary. Every flight was dangerous, but the Mosquito's speed and stealth gave it the best odds of success. It was the only twin-engine aircraft that could operate like a single-seat fighter and land on a field meant for ox carts, disrupting enemy communications. Another role, often forgotten, was electronic warfare. Special jamming Mosquitoes flew ahead of bombing raids, using high-frequency interference to jam German radar, scramble night, fighter coordination, and spoof air traffic signals. Other Mosquitoes carried chaff dispensers, dropping strips of aluminum foil to mimic false radar echoes and throw off tracking systems. These missions didn't make headlines, but they saved countless bombers from being shredded by flak and interceptors. Without the Mosquito's shadow work, Allied losses over Germany would have been far worse. No glory, just results. The crews who flew these missions rarely received public recognition. They weren't dropping thousands of pounds of bombs. They weren't scoring high-profile fighter kills. But they were rescuing resistance fighters, delivering the tools of sabotage, and sabotaging the Nazis where it hurt most. In their control, order, and reach, the Mosquito proved that war wasn't just won by firepower. It was won in moments of silence, precision, and resolve by the aircraft that didn't just fight, but enabled others to fight back. May 1945, Northern Germany, just days before surrender. The sky is quiet now. No flak, no sirens, only the rhythmic hum of twin Merlin engines slicing through morning haze. Inside the cockpit, Flight Lieutenant Robert Shields checks his compass and altitude. His navigator, Sergeant Lewis, reads off coordinates. The war is almost over, but there's one last target, a final German communications hub still broadcasting encrypted orders to isolated pockets of resistance. It's not a bombing run. It's a shutdown. The Mosquito skims in low. The crew knows this is likely the last time they'll fly into enemy territory. One last mission, one last strike. They release the payload, direct hit. The transmitter tower folds like paper. Minutes later, they cross back into Allied airspace. No damage, no contact. It's over. The Mosquito had done its job. Again. The numbers tell the story. By the time the last sortie landed, the Havilland Mosquito had flown more than 39,000 operational missions across every theater of the war. It was a recon plane that mapped every inch of Nazi territory, night fighter that shut down the Luftwaffe's nocturnal edge, bomber that hit targets too precise for four-engine heavies, spy taxi, electronic jamming platform, resistance supply plane, and more. From its first combat mission in 1941 to its last in 1945, the Mosquito rewrote the rules of air combat, not with brute strength, but with speed, brains, and versatility. A plane that did everything. While other aircraft were built for one job, the Mosquito proved it could do nearly all of them, and often better. Need to photograph V-2 rocket sites in daylight? Use a Mosquito. Want to destroy Gestapo archives in the center of a city? Send a Mosquito. Need to deliver a British spy into a moonlit French field? The Mosquito could do that too. Want to harass Nazi airfields, disrupt radar, or jam night fighter coordination? One plane could handle all three. That flexibility made it one of the most cost-effective and widely deployed multi-role aircraft of the entire war. Out of the 7,781 Mosquitoes built, more than 1,100 were produced in Canada, and many of them returned to the skies post-war, serving in air forces across the world, from Sweden to Israel. What made it so special? It wasn't just the materials, though building a high-performance warplane from wood was unheard of at the time. It was the philosophy behind it. Simplicity, speed, and purpose. The Mosquito didn't try to outmuscle the enemy. It outthought them. It flew past what radar could track. It struck before flak could load. It escaped before fighters could launch. It proved that with the right design, two men in a plywood aircraft could accomplish what entire bomber groups sometimes couldn't. A quiet Canadian triumph. To this day, many people still don't know just how much of the Mosquito's impact came from Canada. The forests that provided the wood, the thousands of skilled hands, women and men who shaped, glued, and sanded the wings, the ferry pilots who braved the North Atlantic to deliver them to Britain. Canada didn't just support the war effort, it helped shape the aircraft that became the deciding factor in countless missions. Every time a German bomber failed to return, every time a train stopped running in occupied France, and every time resistance fighters received a crate of weapons under moonlight somewhere, a Canadian-built Mosquito had been there first. After the smoke cleared, when peace returned, the Mosquito didn't fade into obscurity. It became a legend. Pilots who flew it never forgot it. Crews who faced it remembered it with fear and respect. And historians would later agree, it was one of the most important aircraft of World War II. Not because of its firepower, but because of what it represented, an idea that worked. In the words of those who knew, "You felt like you were flying the future," said one RAF pilot. "Everything else looked heavy. This felt like a knife. The only time I felt completely safe over Germany was when I was in a Mosquito." Even Hermann Göring admitted, "It makes me furious." The British built the most versatile aircraft in the world out of wood. And that's the legacy. A plane that looked fragile, that sounded impossible, and yet became the deadliest, most feared, and most admired aircraft of the war. Built by carpenters, flown by aces, feared by generals. The Mosquito didn't just fight the war, it outflew it.